Shots in arms and money in pockets. That's what President Joe Biden promised he would do in the first 100 days of his presidency. And by all accounts, he is delivering. Checks are in the mail from the $1.9 trillion stimulus bill passed by Congress and signed by Biden last week. The bill is expected to boost the economy this year to the highest level in decades and reduce the number of Americans living in poverty by, get this, 1/3. If payments reduce poverty, though, the question we're asking today is why did it take so long to get here? We got answers and more coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report.
From billions of dollars to states, cities, and schools to a historic child tax credit, President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris hit the road last week for their Help Is Here tour to tout the American Rescue Plan and its benefits to low-income and middle-class families. Now, unlike Trump's first piece of legislation in 2017 that focused on cutting taxes and putting money in the hands of big corporations and wealthy executives, Biden's response to the pain and devastation caused by coronavirus is focused on everyday Americans, Americans who were hit hard by the pandemic. But this legislation, which is overwhelmingly popular with Democrats and even some Republicans, was passed in Congress without a single vote by a GOP lawmaker. Republican opponents to the bill say it's a big waste of taxpayer dollars. They say it will increase inflation and ultimately hurt poor families. They also say it's going to discourage Americans from getting back to work and is going to put money in the hands of rapists and murderers. Now, our guests today say these detractors are dead wrong. Here for our leadoff panel is Curran Suarez. She is the mother of 6 who had to quit her job last year. She says this bill is a game changer for families like hers. Welcome, Curran. Thank you so much for joining me this morning. You are the mother of 6 beautiful kids ranging in ages from 2 to 16. I know your day must be incredibly busy. I just want to talk with you a little, though, about this last year. We know that the pandemic hit everybody, really, but particularly moms like yourself, mothers who have had to deal with working as well as a lot of the homeschooling and the distance learning. It's been really tough. Tell us what it's been like for you and your family.
Well, first off, thank you, Areva, for having me here. I really appreciate this opportunity to be able to speak on behalf of my family and others who have had hit hard during this pandemic. My family, we started off, all of my kids were in school, and as soon as the pandemic hit, I have 3 deaf children, so I should state that. So the remote learning was really challenging for them. So my family and we made the decision to pull them from school. So I'm actually homeschooling them now as well. So that was a major change for my family. And then I have the 2 older kids who are in high school, who are remotely learning as well. So as you can imagine, 6 kids and 2 adults and 1 dog, that's a lot of food on the table.
Yeah, and managing the different school schedules of teenagers who are in high school. You've got kids who are in elementary school, and then I'm imagining I'm a mom of a special needs son, so I know your deaf kids probably have like a whole different set of learning and instructions and things that they have to do. So one, congratulations. You're still standing. You're beautiful. You're sane. So I just have to acknowledge that. I have to acknowledge you look amazing. And sometimes people don't appreciate how much work mothers do. I mean, it's, we talk about mothers working in the home and outside the home. Mothers that work in the home are working twice as hard, if not harder, than women who work outside the home. So just kudos to you for holding it all together. And I know it's been really tough during the pandemic. Tell us, with all of that responsibility, have you been able to work at all during the pandemic?
So before the pandemic, I had, a side job, I guess, where I was helping advocate for children who are deaf and hard of hearing. But then once the pandemic hit, the hours started to slow down. And during the pandemic, I actually tried to do a 9 to 5 Monday through Friday at home while my husband works full time as well. So a 9 to 5 Monday through Friday, while I have 6 kids running around and I'm trying to homeschool, and I have 3 deaf children who need extra help. So they also have speech therapies and everything. So needless to say, it didn't work out.
Right.
So I had to stop that. And of course, childcare expenses, and it's just not doable.
Yeah, I want to talk about some of those expenses. You talked about your husband and your husband, being able to work during the pandemic, but did things get tough for your family financially, given that you weren't able to, do the side job that you were doing before the pandemic? You weren't able to keep that full-time job. Did you guys find yourselves, feeling the crunch financially?
My husband's a very hard worker, and he works a lot of hours. And if we see things going down, he brings it back up. So, I do know families who were hit very hard, very hard. I know a family who her husband actually lost his job and she didn't have a job. So that left a family, without an income with three children. That's challenging.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure, Curran, you've heard that the stimulus bill that was passed recently by Congress and signed by Biden provides the 1-year child tax credit. And that means millions of families are going to benefit in a way that they haven't. And kids with families, or young kids like yourself, if you have kids under the age of 6, this tax credit is going to pay out what's essentially $300 a month over this year for families. And then even kids who are over 6 years old are going to be eligible for $3,000 over this year. What do you think that kind of tax credit? I mean, is that do you know if your family will qualify for the tax credit?
I'm sure my family would. Being 8 people and one person working, I'm sure we would. And I think it would be an absolute game changer. My main goal is to get back into the workforce so I can help financially. And in order to do that, childcare expenses right now, if I were to try and work, it'd be working to pay for childcare, and I can do that myself, rather than paying somebody else to do it. I think it would absolutely benefit any family, really.
And that's one of the we hear often talked about when they talk about the stimulus bill, is the ability for moms like yourself to go into the workplace and to use that money, that added $300 or $3,600 is what it's going to be for kids under 6, and $3,000 for kids over 6, is to be able to pay for childcare, because we know childcare is incredibly expensive. And a lot of moms in particular aren't able to work outside the home because of the expenses with childcare. But we also have heard, Curran, some people push back and say this amount of money is going to de-incentivize mothers, some mothers like yourself, from going to work. What do you say to those folks who say this is a disincentive to work if you're going to get, $3,000 or $3,600 per child in this benefit?
I mean, for myself, I can really only speak for myself. My family, for me, I've been trying to get back into the workforce, and it's just, this would be extremely helpful in that situation. As far as making it so moms won't want to go back to work, I don't think that's the case at all, because maybe it's not enough to have a mom stay home, but it is something to put food on the table or gas in the car to get you to work. You know what I mean? So I think it's important to note that there's many hardworking moms out there as well as fathers.
And some people have been critical also, Corinne, of the bill, saying that people won't use the money for its intended purpose. They won't use it for childcare or gas, as you mentioned, or food or, rent, those essentials. That this is almost like, extra money that folks are going to just use for entertainment and other non-essentials. What do you say to those people who, level that critique?
Well, I really feel that, especially parents who have children, you have that extra income, and if you're a decent human being, you're going to provide for your child, and your family. And if that means putting money aside to, in case a car breaks down or anything along those lines, I really feel like people are going to use it for good. And I can't really speak for everybody because I don't know everybody's situation, but in most people's case, I would say that it would benefit them in the long run, and it would help families supporting their children.
Biggest hope for your kids this year? Looks like, more people are getting vaccinated. More things are opening. Some schools are actually opening up. What's your biggest hope as we start to get back to some semblance of normalcy?
My biggest hope is that I can provide an amazing education for my children, and get back into the workforce. And I just hope that everybody stays healthy and happy throughout all of this.
Well, thank you so much, Curran, for sharing your story with us. My hope as well, I know mothers like you all over this country are looking forward to getting this benefit, because it is, for some families, it's going to be a game changer. Women will be able to get back to work. They'll be able to pay for childcare, pay for those essentials. And as we all want, do the best for our kids. Good luck to you, particularly your kids who have special needs. They have a special place in my heart. Love to see moms like yourself who are not giving up, who did not let this pandemic defeat them. It's been tough. It's been really tough for a lot of parents. But we're moms, we're resilient, and you show the world we're still standing. So again, thank you, Curran, for joining me this morning.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Areva. I really appreciate your time.
My next guests have worked for decades on ending poverty and improving the lives of low-income families. They believe the American Rescue Act is a big step in the right direction. Joining me is Dr. Megan Curran. She is a research scientist at Columbia University Center on Poverty and Social Policy. And also joining me this morning is Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis. She co-chairs the Poor People's Campaign along with Reverend William Barber. She's also the author of Always With Us, What Jesus Really Said About the Poor. Good morning, Dr. Curran, and welcome back to the show, Dr. Theoharis.
Thanks so much for having me.
Hi, yes, thanks for the invitation.
So you both heard Curran talk about how hard it's been during the pandemic. She had to give up her job. She has 6 kids at home. 3 of those kids have been deaf. And her story, it's not a solo story. We've heard about the devastation of this pandemic. We've seen, some experts say that we have had an increase in poverty, exponential increase in poverty in 2020. We've seen people standing in food lines. We know that low income and middle class families are hurting. Help us understand, Dr. Theoharis, what this pandemic has done to families like Curran's and families all across this country.
Well, before this pandemic even hit, there were 140 million people in the United States of America who were poor or one small emergency, healthcare crisis, job loss, car repair, storm, hurricane, away from economic ruin. That was before this pandemic even hit. And so then you add to that, like a year's worth of weeks of the highest unemployment, higher than even during the Great Recession. You add to that, people losing their healthcare, tens of millions of people losing their healthcare. You add to that, just like what we were hearing, and I've experienced myself, kids at home having to try to learn at the same time as folks are trying to work and just make ends meet. And so what it means is that millions more people have been thrust into poverty, into economic precarity. What came out last week was that 40% of the people that have gotten sick wouldn't have had to been sick from this pandemic, but have gotten sick and had it worse because of the lack of health care. I mean, so the problems of poverty and injustice that existed before that have only deepened in the course of this past year, really put this country in a difficult spot. And it means, so many millions of stories like we just heard, of loss, of precarity, of hardship, of not being able to put food on the table when we throw out more food than it takes to feed everybody, right? And so this is very serious, but it doesn't have to be this way.
Well, we've heard reports, Professor Curran, that the child tax credit included in this recent stimulus bill will result in 66 million people getting more money and will lead to the most substantial one-year reduction in child poverty in U.S. history. Are we getting that right? Is that how substantial this child tax credit that's embedded in the stimulus bill is?
Yes, the child tax credit is one of the most important pieces, especially for families with children. But just to back up for a second to put it in the context of the broader package itself is important. It's a huge bill, right? It has many different pieces, but it's important that it has so many pieces because essentially families have been hit so hard in many different ways. And it's not, we can't have a one size fits all response because, there wasn't a one size fits all crisis that families were facing. And so the stimulus package or the American, rescue plan here, it basically has things for families in all different circumstances. So there's, continuation of expanded unemployment benefits for those who have, lost work and have been having trouble in this economy finding something again. There's the stimulus or emergency relief checks to cover basically any type of sort of expense that you're fearing, whether or not you're in and out of work. You might have just lost hours, so you're not receiving unemployment benefits, but you still need extra cash to make ends meet. There's different forms of childcare assistance, different forms of rental assistance to help people stay in their homes. And then there's expanded food assistance through the SNAP program, which is crucial. And then, some of the things that have gotten a lot of attention lately are these expanded tax credits. So there's an expansion to the earned income tax credit, but most notably, there's this really a new transformational version of the child tax credit, which, really, I think, one of your earlier guests talked about it, potentially being a game changer for her family. And that's, one of the ways that we kind of look at it, what it could do for sort of children and child poverty in general.
So, Reverend Theoharis, economists are saying that this child tax credit, which is again one of the hallmarks of the stimulus bill, will go to a huge portion of the population. Some say the credits will go to 60% of Americans and will increase their income on average by 11%. And as it relates to the bottom 20% of American earners, they'll see an increase of 33% increase in their income. If this bill is having this kind of impact on so many Americans and literally pulling what may be a third of Americans out of poverty, why did it take us so long to get here?
Well, I think this is a really important point, that what we have seen in this bill and in general is that policy can have an extremely positive impact on the lives and livelihoods of people. And it's good for the economy. What we know is that when people have more money in their pockets, when people are able to pay their bills, able to pay their rent, able to buy sufficient food for their families, able to keep kids that are growing in new clothes, that boosts everybody up. That increases the economy for everyone. And so we should do a lot more of this, and we should make it more permanent, right? These kinds of benefits are only temporary. And yes, they're gonna do a lot of good for a lot of people, but we need actually more, not less of this. That this is the kind of lifting that we need to do. And yes, it's gonna impact the those that were living below the poverty line, but it's also going to impact those that were living so close to the poverty line that we're still actually living in poverty and economic precarity. And that's why that's why 2/3 of Americans, actually need something like this, even though anyways, it's just that we need this, and this is going to help people, and we need to do more of it, and we need to make it permanent. And this is the only way to kind of heal the fissures that were already existing that have deepened in our society.
Yeah, and you talk about it being temporary, and we should state that this child tax credit is only right now slated to last for a year. Let's talk about the particulars of it, Professor Curran. The transformational tax credit is going to give kids who are under 6 a benefit of $3,600 a year, and those that are 6 to 17, $3,000 a year. Now, the tax credit, some form of a child tax credit, has been around since 1998. But the benefit under this new credit, the new credit under the American Stimulus Act or the American Rescue Act, is substantially higher. And it allows families who are working to receive the credit, as well as those that are not working, which is a big difference in the past. Help us understand that, some of the big differences between what we had in 1998 and what we're seeing in 2021.
Right. So the way that, we have historically structured the child tax credit in the US, which, there are similar forms of it just by different names that have been in place in many other countries for decades and decades. But the US was kind of unique, and we were an outlier, and that the way we structured and delivered our child tax credit was a bit backwards. We actually left out, arguably the kids who needed it most. And what that means is there was a sort of very complicated earnings sort of phase in and eligibility structure that meant that essentially 1/3 of all children in the United States prior to this most recent bill passing were left out of the full child tax credit. They did not receive it essentially because their parents didn't necessarily earn enough to qualify. What this new version of the child tax credit means is that children are eligible just because they are children. It doesn't matter now necessarily whether, their parents, are in part-time work or full-time work. We know, through the pandemic, unfortunately, that, sometimes there's really little control over how much work is available to a family or a parent. And so kids won't be penalized anymore, essentially, for whatever the employment status or the income status of their family is. They will be eligible for, the full benefit well up into the income distribution until it starts to phase out at the very highest level. But the kids who were getting the child tax credit beforehand will still get it. But what we're doing actually is just closing the gap and making sure that the kids who had been excluded before also now can receive it as well.
Let's talk about some of the pushback, because there has been a lot of opposition and detractors to the general stimulus bill, the $1.9 trillion, but particularly to this child tax credit. Some of the opponents have said that it wasn't narrowly tailored, and that some families making as much as 6 figures in income will receive this money. What do you say to those, Reverend Theoharis, that say, look, if you're making $100,000 or $120,000, you shouldn't receive $3,600 or $3,000 from the government for this 1-year period? I think we've lost your audio. We'll work on getting Reverend Theoharis back. Professor Curran, maybe you could answer that question for us. What do you say to those opponents who say if you're making $100,000, you shouldn't get this money?
I mean, I think it's useful to point out that families at that level of income have been receiving the existing child tax credit. The child tax credit was actually expanded in the 2017 tax reform that went through Congress. And actually made families with even higher incomes eligible for it, up to $200,000 and or even $400,000, depending on their tax filing status, a 1-parent household or a 2-parent household. kids, it costs money to raise children, and it's in our society's best interest to make sure that kids,
So
no matter where they're living and what kind of families they're living in, are well cared for. But the problem with the prior version of the child tax credit was we were leaving out kids and the lower part of the income distribution. And so again, this is really kind of closing the gap, and making sure that those kids have it. And the kids with the higher incomes were receiving it beforehand. They will continue to do so. And we know from other countries, they've had this in place for many years, for many decades, I should say. Some form of a child benefit or child allowance. It's called different things in different places. Something that has been in place in many places since, after World War II. And in many cases, these programs are universal or close to it as well. And so, it's just a kind of a broader recognition of the fact that, we as a society care about children. This is our way of making sure that families can use the money to meet whatever their needs are. If they're higher up in the income distribution, you can still always use money to maybe meet some educational needs for children. Sometimes there's still health needs, special health needs for kids. All of these resources come in handy, but now we're making sure that kids who are in families who really need it are also being reached.
Oh, all right. I hope you're back, Dr. Theoharis, because this is a perfect question for you. Marco Rubio, senator from Florida, has had a lot to say about the tax credit. He says it's another form of welfare. He says it will incentivize people to get jobs. He says if ending poverty was as simple as handing moms and dads checks, we would have solved poverty a long time ago. And then this is the one that really gets me, and I think you have a lot to say about it. He says that marriage and community are key to ending poverty, and it's not pro-family to remove financial incentives for low-income people. What do you say to Senator Marco, Dr. Theoharis?
So I think, in our Constitution is to promote the general welfare. Welfare is in our Constitution. And yet somehow we have demonized the idea that families and that are living in a rich society should have to be embarrassed and ashamed of the fact that they're making low wages, that they're working multiple jobs and still unable to keep a roof over their heads and food in their kids' mouths. And so we have to shift the whole narrative. And hopefully this debate where we're finally seeing poverty on the national agenda is a part of that. What is so powerful about this stimulus is that it starts from the bottom up. And that's what we in the Poor People's Campaign have been talking about for a while now, that when you start with those who have the least, that you're able to lift from the bottom so that everybody can rise. And indeed, that is what happens. And so if we want flourishing communities and strong families, then we have to let parents make a living wage. We have to provide health care for people. And we have to make sure that kids have the education and the food and the resources they need. Ending poverty is simple. We do not have scarcity. We have abundance. The only scarcity that we have in this country is scarcity of political will. And so what we're seeing in people organizing and then also in public policy that puts people first, that lifts from the bottom, is that we have a shot at actually promoting the values that this nation says that it's about, which is it was life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and promoting this kind of general welfare. And we can do it, and we must do it.
I want to ask you, Professor Curran, specifically as it relates to Rubio's statement about putting checks in hands. He says if it were as simple as handing moms and dads checks, we would have solved poverty a long time ago. And he says we're not learning from the lessons of the past. Is he wrong about that? He's basically saying, poverty giving money to poor people isn't the way to end poverty. Is he right or wrong about that?
What I can speak to is from some analysis that my colleagues and I at the Columbia Center on Poverty and Social Policy did just, last year in 2020. As soon as the pandemic hit, we started trying to look at poverty in a slightly different way. Usually the way we traditionally measure poverty in this country is taking kind of a 1-year look back. We wait until the year is done, And then we, use data collected from the census and other ways to kind of see how much, did families have in 2019 altogether? Were they above or below a certain threshold? For context, what we're talking about here in this particular measure that we use from the Census Bureau is a poverty threshold of approximately $28,000 a year to support a family of four. So that's how much money you need to, that's how much money that a family would have to cover every single cost that they have in life, from housing to transportation to food to healthcare, everything. It's not a lot of money. A lot of people argue it's not even close to enough in some ways. But what we saw in 2020 is that if you look, kind of month by month in real time, there was a huge, sharp and, sort of serious shock to the economy back in around March when the pandemic hit and everything closed. Unemployment skyrocketed. Poverty essentially could have risen to the highest that it was in more than 50 years in the country. But when things like the CARES Act came in with the first round of stimulus checks, the expansions to unemployment benefits and things like that, we actually saw poverty, decline in a way from where it could have been. And it made a real difference over the spring and summer. We saw poverty start to rise again last fall when the supports went away because things were time limited. So when the stimulus checks were spent that first time, when unemployment benefits were allowed to expire, we saw 8 million more people below that poverty line in September 2020 than there were in May 2020, even though unemployment was much higher earlier in the year. So we know that getting cash to families works. We know that it actually does make a difference in terms of poverty.
So I think we just need to make it plain. He's wrong. Let's just call it out. Is he just flat out wrong that putting money in the hands of mothers and fathers does impact people's poverty level? Can we just say that?
Well, it does impact poverty because poverty essentially is measured on an income basis. And so if you do, provide more resources to families, it's going to change the poverty line.
I just want that to be really simple. I don't want folks to leave this conversation. We can talk about unemployment rates. We can, talk about statistics, but I think it's fundamentally important that we push back against the narrative that says that giving money to poor people somehow doesn't impact their poverty. That's just counterintuitive and it's wrong. And I think it's been it's been embedded in policy, and why we're asking the question as to why now are we seeing this historic bill pass that's going to impact poverty, bring a third of people out of poverty, but we're getting to it in 2021. We didn't get to it in 2010. We didn't get to it 20 years ago. And, people who are existing at the poverty level or below are asking, how long do we have to wait? We saw under Donald Trump this massive tax cut that put, billions of dollars into the hands of the wealthiest people in this country and did very little to lift people out of poverty. So I think we just got to be bolder about saying they're wrong, that money in the hands of people, as you just said, the statistics prove it, does impact people's poverty level. And it is what this country needs to be doing more. We saw some experiments in Stockton, California. We've seen it in Compton, California, and St. Paul, and other cities that are experimenting with guaranteed income. And the results so far, back from those early reports back, are that those income in Stockton, I think it was $500 a month that they were giving to families. It improved the quality of life of people in those cities. It helped people move from unemployment to employment. People, use the money for essentials. It wasn't like people were just out partying with the money. So I think we've got to do a better job, those of us who believe in these kinds of programs, of promoting them and pushing back on these false narratives that folks like Rubio and some of the other Republican senators have been pushing to demonize, as you said, Reverend Theoharis, people who are in need in this country. I know, Professor Curran, you've got to run. I want to thank you so much. Dr. Theoharis is going to stick around. I want to bring into this conversation. Thank you so much, Professor Curran, for joining us this morning for this conversation. Dr. Theoharis, I want to keep you here because we're going to keep talking about some of the pushback to this bill. And I want to bring into this conversation now Kristie Puckett Williams. She is the director of the statewide Smart Justice Campaign for the ACLU of North Carolina. Good morning, Kristie, and welcome back to the show.
Morning.
I wanted you to come on, Kristie, with Dr. Theoharis, and we have another guest that's going to come on and talk about this issue, because another big piece of opposition that we've seen to the Child Credit Act and to the bigger stimulus bill, particularly those $1,400 checks that are going out to families, is the fact that they're going to people who are incarcerated. Now, when the first two stimulus bills were passed by Congress, signed into law under Donald Trump, there was a provision that the supplemental checks went to people who were incarcerated. And we didn't see Republican senators jumping up and down and pulling their hair out and setting themselves on fire, complaining about it. But now, under the new third stimulus act that was passed without any GOP support, signed by Biden, has the same provision that provides that these supplemental checks, now $1,400, go to people who are incarcerated. And all of a sudden, the world is falling apart. Senator Cotton and others are accusing Biden and his administration of sending money to rapists and murderers and wasting taxpayers' dollars. What are they getting wrong about that, about the provision, not the new provision, but the existing provision, Kristie, that has been in each of the stimulus bills that puts money in the hands of people who are incarcerated?
Well, number one, Areva, I think it's shameful for elected officials to try to score political points by taking advantage of people who are already disconnected from their communities, from their families, disappeared from society. They've already been punished. They are already serving their time. And so to impose further sanctions that weren't in place at the time of their sentencing is just cruel and unusual. It goes to the punitive nature of harming mostly Black, brown, and poor people. Because let's be clear, the people who we're talking about are Black, brown, and poor people. And we also forget that, again, these are people, that just because someone's incarcerated doesn't mean that they don't have responsibilities in the free world. They still have children, they still have families, they still have bills, they still have needs. And so to act as if they don't deserve anything, as if they don't contribute to the economy, when that's not true. Here in North Carolina, our prisoners work, and they work in our meat packing facilities, and they produce all of our retirement for state officials, and they do all of our signs and license plates. So these are working people who contribute to the economy. They should also benefit from any stimulus package because they, to Reverend Theoharis's point earlier, that when we lift from the bottom, when we ensure that everyone in our community is taken care of, all of us have a better outcome.
Yeah. And Reverend Theoharis, we saw a class action lawsuit actually had to be filed, and a federal judge had to step in to ensure that those payments were directed to prisoners. And obviously it's not been easy. There's been a lot of red tape. Prison systems have made it very difficult for prisoners to get access to the paperwork that they need to file, to understand what the process is, to even go through to qualify and to receive those payments. What are those opponents getting wrong about giving money to prisoners? Are they just completely, disregarding, as Kristie said, the fact that prisoners do contribute to the economy, and that family members that have been hit hard by the pandemic, who typically may send money to folks who are incarcerated, now don't have that money to send? So there are a lot of things you have to buy in prison. I don't think people know that. You have to pay for personal hygiene matters and pay for phone calls and other things. And they rely on their families. And a lot of those families now don't have money to send to prisoners. So help us understand what these detractors are getting wrong.
And what they're getting wrong is the humanity of all people, and the deservingness of all people. And instead, what they're trying to do is what folks in power have tried to do throughout history, which is to divide us and get us pitted against each other, fighting each other, not paying any attention to the $1.9 trillion that in the Trump tax cut that didn't get into this economy, as opposed to this $1.9 trillion that is now being spread throughout our communities, throughout the states, throughout this nation, and actually helping small businesses, helping healthcare centers, helping public institutions. And so they can try to get us to be scared of each other and fighting each other. But what we know is that when we actually see the humanity in every person, including and especially in prisoners, and when you see the what's happened over the past decades, where so many of the people that are incarcerated right now are actually there because they do not have the resources to pay their bail. Folks are there. Many people, a huge percentage of people, actually not having been found guilty of anything, but they don't have the resources. Their family doesn't have the resources to get them out of prison. And so but even folks that are in there, and serving their time, everybody has a humanity and has needs, and should be able to be able to meet those needs.
Thank you for bringing up that point about the huge number of people who are detained, who've not been found guilty, who've not had their due process rights as it relates to going to trial and having a trial by a jury of their peers. Because under the theory that prisoners shouldn't get the stimulus bill, even those people who there's been no adjudication of their guilt or innocence would be denied access to the stimulus payments. I want to bring into the conversation now Edie Blake. Her son is currently incarcerated in a jail in North Carolina. Good morning, Edie, and thank you for joining us.
Good morning, and thank you for having me.
I read your note to our producer that says your son, Michael, is actually incarcerated. He has 3 kids, 2 sons and a daughter, and he hasn't received a stimulus check. And you say it's a struggle for your family and Michael's family to send him money because of COVID. Tell us a little about what's going on with your son.
Well, he's currently sitting down in the Mecklenburg County Jail waiting sentencing for a federal charge. And he's been waiting sentencing since August of last year. Due to COVID, there's only one courtroom available for 4 different court sessions, and they can't do any sentencing right now. So he hasn't received any stimulus money at all since he's been incarcerated. I did hear that some have on the EIP card, but they're not able to transfer it to their funds where they can access it. It's been a real struggle for his family, trying to keep money on his books so that he can get the necessities that he needs, but we try to do the best that we can do at this time.
Yeah, and Kristie, help us understand what are some of the expenses that someone incarcerated like Edie's son are responsible for?
Everything, every single thing you can think of costs money. So if you are indigent, they have like an indigent package where you can get like some really bad soap and some really bad deodorant. I mean, when I say bad, I'm talking about Areva. It literally makes your arms peel and burn. So like you have to buy things off the commissary because the things that they offer you for free are subpar. But things on the commissary are so expensive. So whereas a stick of deodorant might cost $3 here in the street, inside it might cost $5 or $6. Menstrual products. So women who are menstruating, they have to pay for those products. If you go to the doctor, it's a fee. If you get medication, it's a fee. So people are under the impression that people are getting like 3 hot meals and staying for free. And that's just not true. There are so many ways that people pay to stay incarcerated through money and wealth just being extracted from them and their families. To your point, phone calls are very expensive. And they have to pay for every single thing. If you want to eat outside of those 3 meals, and the food that you eat during those 3 meals is not nutritious, is not healthy, is not good. So if you want any type of to be satiated in any way, you order things from the commissary. A bag of chips that's normally 35 cents or 50 cents in the street might be $2 on there. So not only are they paying for everything, they're paying substantially more for those things than we pay here. And so, your joy, I take it for granted that I can go to the store and buy a Snicker, right? A Snicker bar when I'm hungry. That's something that is a bargaining chip on the inside. If you have a Snickers bar, like that is your money. That is your money. And so like the ability to be able to barter, to trade, to have what you need inside depends on your ability to gather resources for yourself. And if we're so concerned though about murderers and rapists and all of these heinous crimes, then we should resource people people so that they don't feel the need to engage in those behaviors, right? And so people need resources, and restricting resources makes people more dangerous. It contributes to crime. It contributes to the poverty and the violence that we live up under every day. So if we truly want to get to that public safety that Mark Rubio and all these other folks are always talking about, public safety, then we have to fund public safety, which means not just funding the police, but funding the people so that the people can police themselves.
Right. And I want to talk about a couple of lawmakers, well, some states, particularly states like Wisconsin. They say that to the extent prisoners are going to get the stimulus check, that they should be forced to pay restitution with the money. What do you say to that, Dr. Theoharis? Should prisoners be able to use the money for these hygiene, these things that Kristie just described they need for their own health and safety while incarcerated, or should they have to give that money back to the state to pay restitution?
Well, we're talking about American Rescue Plan, and we've been talking about it as relief. Well, how do you take the relief out of a relief package and make that money have to go to the justice system? There's also instances where debt collectors are coming and taking that money, right? People need some basic things, and that's the reason for these stimulus payments. So folks should be able to use that money, and again, when you use that money, it helps both meet your needs and your family's needs, because if you're incarcerated and your family members then have a little more money to be able to on the outside pay their bills, that benefits everybody. And so indeed, we shouldn't be stealing people's money. That's been going on for far too long.
Edie, I want to ask you about Michael. I know he has 3 kids, and I know from experience in helping some formerly incarcerated folks that a lot of people in jail work, and they try to use that money not just to buy things themselves, but to send that money home to help with their kids, to help with their families. How has Michael been able to, if he's been able to, offer any support for his 3 kids at home?
Right at the present moment, he hasn't been able to help due to COVID. They have limited the job openings where he is. So it's been really hard. He hasn't been able to send anything home. So the family has just pulled together, and done the best that we could do at this time.
Yeah, and we know that so many families have been hit hard, Kristie, themselves, and they're not able to, send money. And they also need that money to support kids because, the father or mother, in some cases, is out of the household. What do those folks that say that those family members, shouldn't expect to receive that money, what do you say to them?
Well, I mean, I say that find some compassion and some empathy, because we all fall short of grace and mercy, right? In our lives. And so, all of us haven't always done the right thing. Just because someone is incarcerated or has a family member that's incarcerated does not reduce them to second-class citizenship. It just does not mean that they don't they're already paying the price for whatever they did allegedly or for real, right? They're already paying that price. They're in that cage, disconnected and disappeared from their own humanity, from their families, their communities. And now we want to take even more from them. And that's just not going to do what we want it to do. If we really want people to come home changed, behavior changes and things like that, then we have to do things that incentivize that. And quite honestly, we're taking things from people who already have so little just de-incentivizes them to do anything differently than what they've done. And so I say to those people, find some compassion, find some empathy, and pray to God it's never you that's in that cage.
No, that's an excellent point. And I think people also are missing the point that some people who are coming home, and we know when people come home from jail or prison, oftentimes they are penniless. They have nowhere to go. They have no housing. They have no food. They have no transportation. So for a lot of people who are on their way out, this is going to be, game changing for them in terms of giving them a leg up in terms of getting, their lives back on track. And I want to ask you, Reverend Theoharis, it feels a lot like a litmus test for, who's right, who's good, who's, not good in our society, and that somehow if you're in prison, you're undeserving, while folks who are on the outside, who are not incarcerated, who've done a lot of wrongs, lots of us who've done, horrible, terrible things, but we're not incarcerated, but somehow we're more deserving. How do we take out of our government system of helping people who are in need? How do we remove this whole morality test that I think is at play when I hear some of these arguments by Senator Cotton, Senator Rubio, and some of these other senators?
Well, I'm hopeful that this stimulus bill is going to be a sea change in all of that. Again, in more than a generation, we haven't seen this kind of social programming. And now more things need to happen, and it also needs to be made permanent. But again, it's not talking about the deserving versus the undeserving. It's not saying that there are people and families that are too poor to get relief because they must have done something to deserve that, whether it's because they had to do something illegal to survive, or whether it's because they had more kids than some other, governmental official, some other place thinks, or whether it's because of the low wages that they've had to receive for the jobs that they're able to find. And so what needs to happen is that indeed this whole notion of who is deserving and what people should be ashamed of, as opposed to a society that has impoverished almost half of its people, should be ashamed of that kind of poverty in the first place. And so hopefully this is the beginning of more social programming, more policy that both is effective in terms of eliminating and reducing poverty and injustice, as well as pitting us against each other and saying that some are deserving when all are deserving of the nation's abundance.
Yeah, I was so annoyed when I read that statement from Marco Rubio about, we bring people out of poverty by, supporting families or, encouraging people to get married, because it seemed like, an attack on families that didn't meet his standard of what a family should be. If you're not a middle-class, white, heterosexual family, that you're somehow not deserving of support from the government. Because in my mind, I can't imagine that, he was recognizing, single Black moms or single Latino moms, or, gay parents, or, people who are, non-gender specific, who are raising kids, or blended families, or all the ways that we know families represent and present themselves in our society. It felt such an attack on people of color, and people whose family structures don't look like, the 1950s Leave It to Beaver families. And I think when we hear that and we see that, we've got to be so vociferous and so aggressive and assertive in our pushback, because those are the kinds of attitudes and concepts I think that have obviously have led us to where we are. And this notion that, some of us are more deserving, and that means if you're white, if you're male, and those of us that are not white or male fall into the undeserving categories. Really important conversation. Thank you so much, Reverend Theoharis. Thank you, Kristie. Always good to see you. And thank you, Edie. Wishing your son, Michael, the best, your grandkids, and your entire family. And thank you for sharing your story with us this morning.
Thank you so much.
All right, this is such an important topic. This bill, as we've heard from these experts, is going to be game-changing for so many families. And I am so incredibly proud of President Biden and my good friend Kamala Harris for standing firm and standing up to GOP senators and lawmakers who refuse to even give one vote for the bill. They're complaining about checks to prisoners when those same provisions were in bills that they voted for and applauded Donald Trump for signing. Now all of a sudden, there's something terribly wrong with a policy that was perfectly fine just 6 months ago. We've got to push back on that kind of hypocrisy. We've got to push back on these really white nationalist, white supremacy, notions that get embedded into policy making in this country. Some words to live by before I get out. I want Republican lawmakers that are pushing back on the stimulus bill, and particularly on this child tax credit, to get their facts straight. Get your facts straight. Lawmakers want to compare the new child tax credit to welfare, and by doing so, what they really are doing is demonizing working mothers, low-income families, and people of color. All of these GOP senators need to get their facts straight, and I'm here to help them because I'm going to debunk some of the popular myths about families who get support from this government. Myth number one: people on welfare are unmotivated and not working. That is so untrue. 73% of people receiving public benefits are members of working families. No, they're not lazy. They are working. They are contributing to the tax base of this country. Myth number two: welfare recipients are mostly people of color. I'm sure you've heard it. This myth is dripping with racist assumptions about the lives of people of color. And the reality is, more white people receive food stamps than people of color. Myth number three: undocumented people are stealing welfare benefits from US citizens. Simply not true. And in fact, it's impossible. Undocumented people are ineligible for most government benefits. Myth number four: countless welfare queens are working the system's loopholes. Well, we can thank Ronald Reagan for this racist trope. It, like most of them, it's a false statement. It's completely false, based on one case that happened in Chicago decades ago, where apparently, Ronald Reagan and Republicans found one woman who exploited the system. But it's not true of most of the hardworking women and men who receive government benefits from this country. Myth number five: once a person goes on welfare, they will freeload off it for years. Again, this is false. There are stringent requirements that prevent people from receiving benefits for extended periods of time. And myth number six: welfare programs are eating up valuable tax dollars. That's what you're hearing the GOP senators say now. Oh my God, this new stimulus bill is going to increase the U.S. deficit. It's spending billions of dollars. It's wasting billions of dollars. But the reality is, a very small percentage of the federal budget is spent on benefits for low-income families and children. More money from the U.S. government is spent in any given year helping Amtrak and bailing out big airline companies. In short, don't believe the hype. Your tax dollars aren't going to waste. 7 to 11 million children live in households where kids didn't get enough food to eat because their families couldn't afford it. The third stimulus bill passed in Congress and signed by Biden, and its historic child tax credit will help families survive. And factually speaking, if it's good for kids, it's good for America. I'm out, y'all. Be safe out there. Wear your mask. And remember, we are all in this together.